welcome to Let's Talk, a podcast series brought to you by Hazel and Betty Ford. It's a new season too, and we are glad you've tuned in. I'm your host, William C. Moyers. Today we are joined by Dr. Stephanie Covington, whose expertise spans the gamut of issues related to addiction, treatment, and recovery. But specifically today, we talk about how these issues affect women and the importance of gender-responsive care. Thank you, Stephanie, for joining us today. And I thought I would start by asking for your insight on how it is that trauma affects women differently than men.
Well, trauma affects women differently, just like addiction impacts women differently. With trauma, women are much more likely to have interpersonal violence, that the abuse that they often experience in their childhood continues into their relationships as adolescents and then as adults, which is very unusual for a man. So different kinds of abuse and trauma in the lives of men and women.
And what about the big T versus the little t that you talk about? I mean, obviously, sexual violence against a woman would be a big T. What are some of the other traumatic experiences that a woman might have?
Yeah, when we talk about big T are the things that are life-threatening, where you have a fear you're going to lose your life. Small T are the kinds of traumatic events that when you experience them, they have a negative impact, but they're not necessarily life-threatening. So we find that, more often boys are bullied, girls are teased. If we look at what happens on cell phones, girls are stalked in ways that boys generally are not. So there's different kind of traumatic experiences for youth. And for women, same thing with women are more often stalked than men are in their adult lives.
When did our field become cognizant of the need to take a different approach to clinically treating women?
Well, it's been a slow evolutionary process. And it really started in the 70s with the women's movement. And women came together in the 70s and they talked about, in small consciousness raising groups, they talked about the realities of their lives. And we heard about domestic violence, childhood sexual abuse, addiction to alcohol and other drugs. And in the 70s, the federal government set up 12 demonstration projects, addiction treatment for women around the country. And then from there, we moved into the 80s and people started talking about gender responsive treatment. And then in the 90s, I developed a definition for gender responsive treatment. And so it's been a process. It's just like most things in life, it's been a developmental process.
Give us that definition, please, if you would, about gender responsive care.
Sure. So initially the definition was this: it's creating an environment through site selection, staff selection, program development, content and materials that reflects an understanding of the realities of the lives of women and girls, and it deals with their strengths and challenges. And then we, after doing all this work with women, and we kept saying to people, if we get it right with women, this is going to improve services for men. So now we talk about being gender responsive for men. Same definition. You think about the site, you think about the staff, you think about the materials, you think about the realities of men and boys' lives and what are their strengths and challenges. And now more recently, we've expanded that to include the transgender, non-binary community. So it's still thinking about how people express gender and thinking about how that relates to helping them heal and recover.
So much of the treatment in the United States and so much of the recovery process is oriented around the 12 steps. And yet in the 12 steps is an emphasis on powerlessness. How does that square with what many women experience or transgender people experience about powerlessness in their own lives?
Right. Well, but think about what that first, we admitted we were powerless over. You can't talk about powerlessness unless you talk about the word over. The 12 steps don't ask me to say I'm powerless. They want me to acknowledge that I'm powerless over drug of choice, people, places, and things. It's paradoxical. When I can admit where I'm powerless, I actually get an increased sense of internal sense of power in my life. So, early on, many feminists critiqued the 12 steps for women and said, it's not good because you're telling women they're powerless. I said, no, you're misunderstanding what it says. It doesn't say that. And we want people to have an internal sense of it, but it's also about humility. It's that I have my own internal sense of power. And when I look at that compared to the enormity of the universe, I see how small that is. So it's a both and.
Are there other pathways to recovery for women that are not the 12-step based pathway?
Sure. I think that's one of the pieces that's been hard for the addiction field, because it was founded in a way on the 12 steps in this country, to understand that people recover in a variety of ways. And there have been several programs that have been developed for women that are not 12-step based. I happen to be a proponent of the 12 steps because I don't think anyone recovers, any woman in particular, but I don't think anyone recovers in isolation. And the 12 steps provide for a sense of community. And where can you find a group of people who are managing their lives without alcohol and other drugs, and you can go and it's free? And what in this country has value that's free? I mean, we charge for everything. So it's actually quite a radical program when you think about it. Non-hierarchical, free, and spiritual.
Is there room for male clinicians in a gender responsive care setting that is specifically focused on women?
Sure. I mean, in that definition, it says staff selection. And early on, we said that only women should work with women. And quite honestly, pretty soon we met women that shouldn't work with people. So that wasn't such a good plan. Certainly there are roles for men in women's treatment, and some of the most powerful roles for men really are non-traditional roles. If you can have a man running a group on domestic violence or running a parenting program, let me tell you, women really listen, because very few of them have ever met a man who's interested in those two issues. So there's definitely a role for men in women's treatment. Now, I have to say, the caveat being, the materials I write are written so the groups are facilitated by women. Not because of the skills of men, but women need this role model, a strong female role model. And the topics that we talk about, women are often uncomfortable talking about with men. So there is a role for men in women's treatment. In the materials I write, I prefer that the groups are run by women.
How about in the GLBTQ community? Should patients be working with clinicians who have the same sexual orientation or not?
I don't think it has to be the same. Or for the LGBTQ community, there needs to be some staff members that are part of this community. I mean, staff really should reflect the clients that they're treating, whatever that might be. And so for everybody on the staff to be cisgendered, heterosexual, treating LGBTQ, I don't think so. I think staff needs to reflect the clients that they're working with.
I know that the topic of gender responsive care is what we are focused on today, but what about gender responsive recovery? What is your perspective on how women or people or others apply their recovery pathway? Should it be gender? Should they be sensitive to gender responsiveness in that regard too?
Well, sure. I mean, think about it. I think, and maybe you and I will agree or disagree on this, we're both in recovery. I think it's really important in my recovery that I attend some women-only meetings. And my recommendation that you as a man, it would be really good for you to attend some men-only meetings. Because I think people talk differently when they're not in a co-ed setting. And I think there's a different level of honesty and a different level of conversation. So yeah, I think it makes a difference.
One area that you've really risen in terms of being a public advocate at the national level is around gender and justice. Can you explain where that comes from?
Well, again, everything just evolves, right? I start working in the addiction field, then I see the connection to trauma. And I become really interested in women in the criminal justice system. And it was one of the flukes of life, really. I was in North Carolina and I was speaking at a women's conference and standing in a group of women, and a woman had on a tag that said warden, her name tag. And I was like, I don't know any wardens. And I ended up being able to talk her into letting me live for a couple days in the women's prison the next year. And when I left the women's prison, I knew it was my work. Just how we know things, and so that led me to doing work in prisons, starting with women's prisons and then now men's prisons, but also juvenile justice, boys and girls.
So you saw somebody at a conference with a warden name tag on. You went and spent a couple of days locked up.
Yes.
What did you come out? How did that change you?
I will not say that because I chose to go in and was lucky enough she let me do it and put on a uniform for 2.5 or 3 days that I really know what it's like to live in a prison. But it was a life-changing experience for me. What was one of the most impactful pieces was what it was like to be connected to women that I never would have met in my life. And that was a very powerful experience. And the other was how the criminal justice system is designed in ways that do not help. And what a waste. And I just knew it was work that I wanted to do. And so, at the time I was actually redesigning women's treatment at Betty Ford out in the desert. And I knew that when that contract was over, somehow I was going to move into the criminal justice system. Didn't know yet how or why, but I knew why, but I didn't know how.
So what are you doing to change how women not just are treated, but get treatment when they're locked up?
Work on multiple levels, and the amount of work and the levels of the work really depends on what state I'm in or what country I'm in. One level is the programming we provide the women. So provide trauma treatment. We provide trauma services to the women, the healing trauma. I have another intervention beyond trauma. We have beyond violence for women who've committed violent, aggressive crimes. The work with trauma in the women's prisons, particularly here in California, led California to now we're doing trauma work with the men in the men's prisons. And then California has just picked helping women recover and helping men recover as the core to their new substance use disorder treatment in all of their 35 prisons.
Wow.
So we've incorporated that. And in other places like England, I've trained we've 12 women's prisons, 17 high security men's prisons in England. We train staff in trauma, how to become trauma informed. Create guide teams in prisons for them to begin to look at how they operate and where they can make changes. And then we also provide services. So it's multiple levels.
That's encouraging. We only have about a minute left, but if people want to learn more about the gender injustice element of your platform, where do they do that?
Well, we have a website called the Center for Gender and Justice, and that talks a lot about the work we do. Like I said, it was originally focused on women and girls, but it's expanded to men. Or my website also has a lot of materials and articles and research and so forth, and also shows the materials we've developed for the criminal justice system.
Well, thanks, Dr. Covington, for your insights and your time. That's all the time that we have for today. And thanks to all of you for tuning into this podcast. If you liked it, make sure to tell your family and friends, colleagues, and fellow travelers to check out our podcasts. And if you didn't like it, shoot me an email and tell me why. On behalf of my colleague and the executive producer, Lisa Stangl, we hope that you remain safe and healthy and resilient in these challenging times. And remember, together we are building a healthier, wholesome, and happier tomorrow, one day and one life at a time. See you soon.